It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. The government all but rules out citizenship for those arriving by small boat, but not all their MPs are happy.
What this message is saying is that we will judge your asylum claim, so we will let you stay in the country, but we will not expect you to be part of our community. And I just gently say to my colleagues on the front bench, I think that is counterproductive. That is not where the British public are at.
We need to build the homes, and we're doing everything we can to turn the tide of decline and build the houses that people desperately need.
But with more than 1 million people, like Jason and his family, on the housing waiting list, will government announcements like this help? A major HS2 milestone with the completion of this junction. But is the London to Birmingham Railway many tens of billions of pounds well spent? All that and, of course, Prime Minister's questions at noon. Joining us today, Labour MP Jo White, Conservative MP Jo Robertson, Times columnist Sebastian Payne and Westminster editor for the Lead UK, Zoe Grunewald. This is Politics Live. Let's start with the news that the Defence Secretary, John Healey, has this morning been meeting with his US counterpart, Pete Hegseth, in Brussels for the first time. John Healey is hosting the 26th meeting of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, replacing the US, who pulled out of the hosting role under President Donald Trump. Now, the US had hosted all 25 previous meetings of this group under the Biden administration, and, of course, it comes amidst worries in Ukraine that Donald Trump may pare back or completely withdraw the US support for the country. So my opening question to the panel is, does Europe and the UK need to bear the burden of facing the Russian threat? Starting with you, Jo.
Well, it's about our future security, and Britain's commitment is that we will be there for as long as it takes. We've already committed £3 billion per year. My concern is if it's not Ukraine, potentially it could be other countries. You know, the route to the UK is that next step further. We're very proud members of NATO, and we say one step, one attack on one of our NATO members is an attack on us all.
But does that mean even more spending being committed to defence if the US, which it does look like it is considering, is going to pull back in some way and expect the UK and EU countries to step in? I mean, we know the government's committed, or we're already spending 2.3% of GDP on defence with a promise to get to 2.5. Should there be a timescale on that?
What I'm saying is we're absolutely committed to supporting our Ukrainian partners. We've been there from the word go, and that will be the language in the conversations that I heard in Brussels today.
What do you think, Jo? Does Europe need to bear the burden or more of it in terms of facing the Russian threat?
Well, I'd like to see the UK increase our defence spending, see the defence budget rise. But I think what this highlights is how important it is to work with Donald Trump as US President across the board, so that we retain a relationship, that special relationship we've already had, to try and keep the US engaged with war in Ukraine and our collective shared interests across the world in defence. That's why having that relationship and maintaining it is so important. The US makes the biggest contribution to NATO, and our global stability has depended on that. We just need to keep the US in and committed to NATO. And
alongside, do you think the EU and members of the EU should step up more in terms of defence spending?
I mean, I think this is the argument that sort of Donald Trump's been making, isn't it? That he wants to see NATO partners do more.
Well, because some of them don't even get to 2% of GDP.
I share that sentiment. I can understand the US's position on that.
Right. What do you think? I mean, should Europe now be stepping up if there is partial withdrawal in terms of cash spending on defence?
I think it's just a fact of life of the Trump administration that Europe is going to have to spend more on defence, whether we like it or not, because you've had that NATO commitment, which has not been met, as you said, by many European countries. And there is a question about what we do here, because you said we're on 2.3 now. Keir Starmer promised 2.5% of spending, but there's been some reporting that might not happen in this particular Parliament because of pressure on the public finances. And I think we're slightly in denial in this country about how serious this threat is, because because see, Donald Trump has come in. There's going to be some kind of walk towards a ceasefire in Ukraine, and if that does happen in the months ahead, then there will have to be some kind of peacekeeping force, and Britain may well be at the front of that. And if that is going to be the case, then we are going to have to spend more. We are going to have a bigger army. And we are going to have it properly funded, and it's not easy. The money obviously does not grow on trees in this situation.
Well, it would have to come from somewhere else.
Correct, but I think we are slightly in denial about this new era of the Trump administration and of the potential of us being involved in Ukraine peacekeeping.
Are we in denial?
Well, I think we're presented with a lot of challenges. I think we're all in agreement that Putin presents a real moral and strategic challenge, and that he is a threat to democracy, sovereignty and international law across the world. I think the idea that cozying up with Trump is somehow going to protect us, I mean, that man is incredibly unstable. It's very, very difficult to know where he's going to go next. He uses countries and alliances like pawns in his game. I think we would be much better hedging our alliances with Europe. It is an alliance we know well. It is trusted. We cannot throw our global security to the wolves on the basis of being kind of a Brexit-focused country. We need to be realistic about the new challenge. And I think with Ukraine can't rely on Trump either. The best way forwards is with Europe, building those strategic alliances. The thing that really frightens Putin is not our military capabilities, it is our unity. And if we are united with Europe on this, I think that is our best defence.
Let's talk about this headline in BBC News. UK to deny citizenship to small boat refugees. This is the story about new guidance going to Home Office officials or caseworkers, stating that anyone who enters the UK illegally, either by boat or in a vehicle, a lorry, will normally be refused citizenship, regardless of the time that has passed. They're strengthening up the measures, the rules and the guidance for refugees who arrive in the UK on small boats to become British citizens. At least one Labour MP, you heard a bit of her in the headline, Stella Creasy, is unhappy. Let's listen to a little bit more.
This is citizenship. This is not granting people asylum, as indeed 2/3 of the people who have come through irregular means and on the small boats have been granted asylum because they have a well-founded fear of persecution. But this change is not about that. It is about when people are here and they have come to this country and they are staying here. So, for example, I have Afghan interpreters who came in that irregular route because the previous government fundamentally failed to take them to safety, and so they came via that route. When they have made a life here, this change means it is unlikely they will ever be able to get citizenship, which is a completely different but important element of the message that we send about integration.
What do you make of that point, particularly about integration?
Well, it's absolutely key that people do integrate, but
they're not likely to, as Stella Creasy is saying, if they're not going to get citizenship.
I very much welcome the government's announcement today, because there has to be a strong deterrent to stop people getting into those boats and risking their lives. I'm always thinking of those children who are taken with them and those lives lost. We have to. It's not just about stopping the gangs and breaking them up and stopping the sources of the boats, the dinghies that are coming across. It's making sure that people don't get in the sea at Calais and come across here.
Do you think that'll work well as a deterrent?
I just don't understand that. I mean, if you're fleeing persecution from a country without a safe and legal route, you know, the deterrent isn't going to work. If getting in a boat and coming over on the English Channel seems to be safer than staying in your country of origin.
We do have some very strong resettlement schemes, the Afghan one.
But we don't have safe and legal routes for every country, as you well know. I mean, why isn't the government focusing on this? The best way to smash the gangs, to stop the gangs, is to introduce safe and legal routes. That breaks up their business model. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that this Labour government, this progressive Labour government, is focusing on deterrence as opposed to schemes that can actually get people here safely.
The biggest issue in my constituency is concern about illegal immigration. And we have to stop that. We have to stop those boats. It's not just about breaking up the gangs and treating them as terrorists. It's about ensuring people don't take those dangerous routes, not just on those boats, but tucked away in those freezer lorries is absolutely appalling. The way people risk their lives. No, it's very, very important that we stop the illegal migrants coming here, and we have to find strong deterrents.
As it's shown, it doesn't stop them. It's not a deterrent. If people genuinely think their lives are safer getting in a boat crossing the English Channel.
This is a new piece of legislation, And I'm keen to see how it will work. I believe it will stop. It would deter people from taking those routes.
Where would you have safe and legal routes from? Everywhere in the world?
Well, yes, why not? I mean, if people have safe and legal routes and they are facing persecution, why wouldn't we let them in? I mean, clearly, we need to have agreements with the rest of Europe as well. So we have, you know, we can make sure that people we can have control over our border security, and we can make sure that people who are coming in this country, we are vetting them. Because, of course, having a border security plan is integral. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But the fact is, with not having safe and legal routes, you open up the channels for those criminal gangs to say, if I put you in a boat and you get over to the UK, you're there. You know, they're not going to send you back. And part of this is, of course, a result of Brexit as well. We stopped having a returns deal with Europe, with France, when we left the EU. That's another thing I think Labour should be looking at.
It didn't work that successfully, the returns bit, but it was there in place. You're right. Let me just come to...
crossings were much lower when we were still in the EU. In fact,
people came over...
It's a different era, though. Like, I mean, obviously, it's not entirely due to Brexit. The small boats crossings have increased.
Exactly.
But there's been a massive increase since 2017 because there's a whole new system opened up where smugglers can tell people, if you get over there, they can't return you to anywhere.
We have to crack those criminal gangs.
I completely agree with you. Of course we do, because people's lives are being put in danger. The other way you do this is, of course, you need to speed up asylum case processing. The Tories deliberately underfunded that. Let it go.
Let's continue. Let's continue on that thought brought up by Zoe. It's true that under the last Conservative government, you wouldn't be able to claim asylum, and that's because asylum seekers, when they arrived here, deemed illegal in terms of the way they'd come over, were going to be sent to Rwanda to have their asylum applications processed. Now, the change this government is making is that you will be able to claim asylum, you just won't be able to claim citizen or apply for citizenship. Do you welcome that change?
It's not a deterrent at all. It's just this complete nonsense that somehow the smuggling gangs are like sort of travel agents, and that they will tell the people they're smuggling all the risks and problems with getting into the UK. These people are being trafficked. It's not a deterrent whatsoever. Look, I think the government is making a big mistake, and I accept that we didn't do enough.
No.
And we lost
by
the
your own
election
metric
quite substantially, partly because of this. But what the Labour government doing is trying to make announcements as though they're going to change the way immigration happens in this country, as though it's going to smash the gangs by ensuring that, you know, leave to remain, etc., doesn't apply in the way it used to, or if you leave someone in the water, it's even more criminal than before. This was the bill that went through earlier this week. The British public are not buying it. It is nowhere near enough. And they're not buying any idea that they're changing.
The British public did not buy the Rwanda scheme at a cost of 700 million. Only 4 people went across. Each of them, that's £140,000 each. They get private education, they get private healthcare, and they get their housing paid for in Rwanda.
So the Home Office put footage out that it was not a deterrent. The Home Office put footage out that it's proud of earlier this week, showing 47 illegal migrants getting on a plane that could have carried 220 as deportations. And the government was actually proud of that. 47 deportations this week. They put the video out. It wasn't that the newspapers saw this.
Don't talk over each other. But as you say, how can you have a leg to stand on the record that you set, rightly or wrongly, to bring down net migration, that's legal migration, and stop the boats, illegal migration, and as you've admitted, you failed on both?
I'm not making a defence of the last government, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that this government can fail on it. Just because the last government didn't do enough doesn't give a wide latitude for this government to come up with all sorts of weak schemes that are not going to shift the dial.
Is it going to make a difference as a deterrent? Zoe doesn't think so. But on the basis that you can claim asylum when you arrive here, you won't be able to easily apply for citizenship. It'll be very difficult. To come to the point, though, that was made by Stella, that if you want integration, it's one of the things Kemi Badenoch has talked about, that surely citizenship is one of those things that will bind people into integrating into society.
Which it does, but this is really, it is about a deterrent. This is not about the wider integration piece here. And I think that if you think what we need to decide really as a country is there's 2 approaches. One is the deterrent approach, and if you take that, then you need something like the Rwanda scheme, so you have a deterrent stop. You need place to stop the gangs. The other approach, which is the one that Zoe's talked about, is one where you have returns deals and you take a more pan-European approach to how you're tackling this. The Conservatives tried to do the deterrent approach but didn't deliver it. it, and it obviously didn't work. We had the returns approach in the past, and it slightly at the moment feels as if the government is trying to decide, do a bit of both, and I don't think it'll work. I think you will have to decide whether you do want to go full deterrent and have very tough measures, or whether you take a European approach and you have lots of returns deals and more legal routes.
Right, well, let me just show you this headline. Jo, this is you. Red Wall Labour MPs want tougher message on immigration. Meeting with the government and Number 10. They've done what you've said. Would you like them to go further?
I want this bill to go through. I'm very keen to help push this bill through. If it takes needs tougher measures following this bill, I will be pushing for them, as will my Red Wall colleagues.
Like what? What sort of tougher measures?
We have to see what's needed next. I'm very keen to look at what safe countries are and how we determine which are safe countries in order to understand where they come from and who can be returned in the future.
Are you in favour of digital ID or some form of ID cards? This is something that Tony Blair has talked about, and he's talked about for quite a long time, to be fair. But he has said that actually having a better tracking of who is in and out of the country to stop people coming in to the black economy where they're having below-the-radar jobs, is that something you think would work?
Personally, I'm in favour of ID cards. I've surveyed my constituents in the past, and they very much believe in ID cards. Many people said during the war they had ID cards and they're very comfortable with using them. I think we're all given a national insurance number at birth, and it's the way that it can be used. We're in a digital age, it's perfectly possible. So it's something I personally believe in, and I will be talking to government about it.
Are you getting a hearing from government?
I haven't raised this issue yet. That's something for the future.
Jo?
I mean, this is a problem we knew we had, OK? We've been struggling to tackle it for several years. We've got a government that's come into power with absolutely no plan, and it's just road testing a few policy ideas as it goes along. I think the public are fed up.
What would you do now, then, instead?
The government should have been putting together a plan in opposition, but look, it needs to be whole-scale, and this is what the Conservative Party needs to be able to put forward at the next election, that includes law change right across root and branch, multi-government departments.
Right. I mean, there is also a political reason behind some of this, which is about shoring up Labour support in the face of Reform UK's rise in the polls. How much is it down to that, do you think?
I think quite a lot, because if you look at there's been several polls that have got Reform ahead as the first party, and various surveys would say if there was an election tomorrow, you'd actually have all three parties on about 150 seats, which would be a quite dysfunctional parliament. But I think my sense within Labour ranks is, yes, they're very concerned about Reform, but of course Nigel Farage is very good at offering big, easy slogans, but doesn't have any detailed ideas. And as we've just been hearing, this is a tough one. I don't think there is one easy fix, but Labour should be worried about this, because people are not looking at the Conservatives again. They're not yet giving the party a new look after 14 years. So if they're disenfranchised with Labour, of course they're going to look to Reform. So that's clearly what's driving this.
Zoe?
I think it's really unwise for the Labour government to not take stock of what happened to two previous Tory administrations, where they tried to bend to the hard right of the party or to Reform, and they just failed. I mean, it doesn't work if you can continue to increase the salience of issues like immigration rather than talking about the real issues that are present in this country. All you do is send voters into the arms of Reform. What would be much better, and what is true from polling of Reform members, is that yes, there is a portion of them that are deeply concerned about immigration, but there is also a higher portion of them who just feel like politics doesn't work for them anymore. If I were in the Labour government, I would be thinking about how can I make people's lives feel better. That's investing in public services, that's strengthening the employment rights bill, renters reform, nationalising public utilities, things like that actually people will look back on and say, my life felt better, I had more money in my pocket, my mum got her doctor's appointment, you know, all these things that didn't happen under a Conservative administration. If you keep talking about immigration and you make voters believe that immigration is the source of all their worries, you're never going to be on top of that they are going to go to Reform.
Jo?
So immigration is one worry. The other worry is whether they can get a doctor's appointment or a dentist appointment, or whether they can get into the hospital when they need treatment, and whether they can get a good job or a highly skilled job. And that's our focus, is delivering on those priorities.
But how worried are you by Reform?
I think they're a challenge, but the biggest challenge is, for me, is to deliver on our priorities in my area. And that's why we set up the Red Wall Group, is to make sure the government is focusing on constituencies like mine, because we have to deliver. And that's why I stood to be their Member of Parliament, is to ensure lives get better. I want people to have money in their pockets so they can choose how they spend it, whether they go on a holiday or whether they have to spend... Or at the moment, they're not even getting it, be able to save the money, and we have to give people choice and control over their lives.
All right, well, one of the other things the government is focused on is building in order to get growth, which appears to be elusive at the moment. BBC headline, HS2 construction at a peak as viaduct is finished. Yes, it's the first of 13 viaducts at a key rail junction, according to rail bosses. Let's talk to our Midlands correspondent, Phil Mackey. He is at the Delta Junction site. Hello to you, Phil. What's going on where you are?
Hi, Jo. Well, they're just sort of celebrating the fact that this first of 13 viaducts has been completed over the River Tame, and it's going to eventually have 13 bridges, bringing 6 railway lines over other railway lines, over waterways, over roads. That's the M42 in the background. There are something like 30,000 people working on HS2 across the country. It really is changing the landscape rapidly at the moment. I've been reporting on this for 15, 16 years now, and for a long time nothing seemed to happen at all. Now, every time you drive along here in this part of the world, it's changed completely, and it's having a massive impact. And this is probably the first really big visible sign of what eventually will become Delta Junction for scale, Jo. There's another big interchange on the outskirts of Birmingham. That's Spaghetti Junction. This will eventually be 3 times as big as that.
Well, it looks impressive from what we can see behind you, but let's talk about the price tag and whether it's good value for money. HS2 could cost up to £80 billion in today's prices. Will that feel like money well spent?
If you go to the other end of it in Birmingham, so in the background there, you can possibly just see those platforms which will take the route into the city centre. Birmingham skyline's filled with cranes, massive redevelopment. That definitely would not be happening without HS2, certainly not on the scale that it is. But along the route, people have always had the pain, and they don't think they're going to get very much gain. We've heard about that massive bat tunnel that Rachel Reeves keeps quoting when she talks about the problems with planning and regulations. They just had to have 3,000 planning consents just for the Midlands stretch alone. That's 7 local authorities, multiple different agencies. Just down here, that green patch of land behind the green fence, they had to build that. That's a great crested newt reserve. They're having a great time down there. It's their best life. But not £100 million. However, it's cost some money, and it's had an impact on the way they deliver this. So whilst a lot of people say, look, we have to have these rules and regulations, there is a sense that everything's slowed down, the costs racketed, not just because of this. There was inflation, there was the COVID pandemic and whatever as well, but there must be a simpler way of trying to get big things built fast so that we can see and reap the benefits in the end.
Phil Mackey, enjoy it all. Thank you very much. Is HS2 worth the money?
Phil actually outlines the importance of it making those connections into Birmingham.
But do you think it's worth the money? £80 billion.
I think the project has overspent dramatically, and that's why we need legislative change in our planning and infrastructure bill will actually make those planning decisions a lot quicker, a lot easier, which means those decisions will be taken faster. The benefits of it, we know we all complained when we had the Channel Tunnel and the huge expense of that, and eventually it was repaid. But people in my constituency are actually part of that supply chain, so it has created jobs in my area as a consequence of building HS2. Which
OK,
is
so
one
they've
benefit.
felt some of the benefits.
Yes.
Do you think it's worth the money? I mean, it does look very impressive, just that one junction.
I mean, look, I think if it had been quoted at that money from the outset, it would have probably never got off the ground. So, you know, by that analysis, possibly not. And, you know, I'm in a constituency to the south of London, so won't benefit the Isle of Wight. I think we do need to have a conversation about how we do big infrastructure projects in this country, and it's not a party political point. I think it's got to the stage where we can't really do it cost effectively. And, you know, there are questions about how much money do you want to spend on a tunnel to protect bats that may or may not be upset by the trains. 100 million sounds too much to me. I suspect it sounds too much to most people. I think we need to have that conversation. And most of these projects don't have direct political oversight either. You know, some of these decisions on quite large sums of money are being made just sort of below the sort of public accountability in that way.
Why is it so expensive, this sort of infrastructure? Why can't we build anything that doesn't sound like it has such a huge price tag?
Well, it's mad when you think HS2 is the first big railway we've built since Queen Victoria was on the throne, because we are obviously a small, dense, highly populated island, so building anything of this scale is very difficult. But the simple fact is, first of all, political leadership has been pretty dire. That this thing was announced by Gordon Brown's government in 2009, and we've had about 4 inquiries into the impact of the thing. Well, we could have just built it. The second thing is that the environmental regulations we have in this country are so intense. They just go on and on and on. You mentioned the famous Bat Tunnel, which is just one example. We've heard about the Great Crested Noose, and I'm sure they're delighted to be living beside a high-speed railway now. But
there is the Bat Tunnel
there is
the
famous Bat Tunnel that's got everyone fantastically wound up.
It's the impression of it anyway, certainly.
Exactly.
Well, it's wound up with good reason, I think, on the cost figure.
Absolutely.
Correct,
there should have been a challenge.
But
there really should have been.
What we have to do is say, if these things matter, which they do, the West Coast Main Line is at capacity. This is a nationally important project, and you have, in some ways, dare I say, bulldoze through the red tape and just get this thing built. And we've had all these planning announcements from the government of 40 new reservoirs, HS2 getting it done, Heathrow runway. I mean, we've heard all this so many times before, and it needs political metal to just cut through that and to take on the vested interest.
And that's what the planning and infrastructure bill will do. That's the whole point of it, so that we can actually get those decisions taken very quickly, very easily, very smoothly, and deal with those environmental impacts as part of it.
Well, with due respect, I think that may well be the case. There'll be a lot of your colleagues who are not going to be happy about all that stuff being built, because it will go through their constituencies, it will build on their green and pleasant lands, and their voters will be unhappy, and you will face the same things that the Conservatives faced.
The key is that we want to use British suppliers. For example, with Heathrow, we were using British steel to be part of that construction. And that's absolutely critical, because that's about rebuilding our economy.
And so you think that'll pacify your constituents? Just before we get on to another project, yes, Heathrow, third runway. So do you want to stick up for the bats and nature and diversity and the new... Because these have become very important considerations.
They have, and they've become sticking points. I mean, when you say £100 million for a bat tunnel, it's hard. As much as you might be a huge bat superfan, you might still feel that seems like an extraordinary amount of money. But I think when you look at the grand scale of things, I think we've all touched on this, just how stop and start this project was, the inquiries, the cost of planning reform, the cost of construction, government contracts that probably ripped us off a little bit, and the fact that there is Treasury brain endemic in the way we make political decisions in this country. You want to put money into a project that's going to cost a lot in the short term, but hopefully have huge payoffs for the North in the long term. Treasury officials and the government and all these other civil servants and politicians, everyone else say, I don't know if we can justify that to our minister, I don't know if they'll like that. So I think there are a number of issues here. I do think we obviously have to care about ecology in this country, our environmental obligations, but there has to be a balance, and hopefully the planning reform stuff will take this into account.
Is it too much in the south, though, Jo? I mean, when you mention Heathrow third runway, I mean, HS2, a lot of it's certainly in the Midlands and then down to the south, and that there isn't enough focus in the north, northeast and northwest.
I agree. I'd love Rachel to come up to the north and do the equivalent speech that she did two weeks ago about the industry and the opportunities that are up in north.
Cambridge
absolutely, because I want more inward investment, and I want investment coming from overseas into our areas, so that we can actually. We need Rachel to talk us up, so that we can get the investment and the...
Right, you're not talking the north up enough.
No, I think it's one of the most frustrating things, this argument about HS2, because it should actually be called high capacity 2. It's not about the speed, it's about the fact the West Coast Main Line is at 98% capacity. By building this new railway, it will free up the existing West Coast Main Line to have more services to other places in the north. So it literally will benefit the whole country.
Right, well, this is the Times headline, Jo, on Heathrow, to push ahead with plans for third runway and new terminals. Do you think it'll get built?
Well, that's a difficult question, isn't it? I mean, I think it should get built.
Look into your crystal ball.
I think it should get built. Again, similar balancing act, particularly with people who live nearby. I completely get why they don't want a third runway, but I think the overriding national interest is to build that capacity at Heathrow, so I support it, and I hope it does get built. And by the way, it's already started off in this similar pattern to HS2, stop, start, stop, start. I'd like to see it get built.
Are you a fan of third runway?
I think we have to have it. I think it's about us being at the centre of the world trade. We are a hub, and we've got to maintain that. And also the impacts of it will spread up to constituencies like mine. But I want more up north, please.
Right. What about the political opposition to a third runway and your environmental commitments? Are you prepared to bulldoze, or do you want to see the government bulldoze through those and your fellow MPs?
We need to ensure that this country is leading the world, and sometimes you have to make sacrifices.
Do you think it'll be built, Zoe?
I don't know if it will be built, to be honest. I think there's going to be... Again, I don't know. Personally, I think I can't see a convincing case of how this is going to adhere to our net zero obligations. That's what worries me. I can understand the push for investment in this country. I can understand wanting to create jobs. I think that's vitally important. But I just don't know if this is the way to go.
Seb?
I think it should have been built 10 years ago, and of course it should be built now, because Heathrow is one of our national jewels, our crown jewels, in the sense that it's a big airport that people want to come and want to use, and it's a great hub, and we've just sat on our hands. But you are right, it's exactly like HS2 all over again, where we'll have lots of discussion, lots of reports. Just get the thing built. We all know we need it. There's now consensus across the spectrum, and I hope you're right, Jo, that the new planning approach, I mean, we won't get in this same mess.
Well, something you can do now, and that is listen to Politics Live on the live news stream on BBC Sounds. Just go to the live dial at the top of the BBC Sounds homepage and tap on live news. Let's have a look at this headline in The Independent. Labour MPs call for the government to support a 4-day working week. The group is calling for an amendment to the Employment Rights Bill. It's 12 Labour MPs, I think, last time we looked, and 1 Green MP pushing for the government to include consideration for a 4-day working week as part of a new set of workers' rights rules. Let's talk to the Labour MP who's leading on this amendment, Peter Dowd, MP for Bootle. Peter, how hopeful are you that the government will take on your amendment?
Well, this is about trying to get the debate going. I had a private member's 10-minute rule bill a couple of years ago, and have tried to push this issue since then. So this, in this Employment Rights Bill, is an opportunity to get this matter aired in a wider spectrum. Whether the government pick it up or not is a matter for the government. I don't think they will, but it's important to get the debate out there.
Right. I mean, do you have any concerns about perception, especially in the public sector, with or without evidence? Lots of people are struggling to access public services, facing cuts to existing services. Doesn't it just look bad?
Well, it's a fair point, but, you know, trying to move employment rights on over the decades, over the centuries, has always come up against arguments as to why you shouldn't do it now. It's a manana approach. Let's do it tomorrow, let's do it next year, let's do it the year after. There's always an argument why you shouldn't do it now. What this is about is trying to get that substantive and fundamental debate going as to whether or not a 4-day week, a 32-hour week, is appropriate given moves in technology and a whole range of issues. So let's have the debate.
All right. Well, let's have the debate. Peter, you stay there. Jo, will you be signing up to the amendment?
Not at all. When I was deputy leader of my council in Bassett Law, this was brought up and I strongly argued against it.
Why?
Councils have to be open 5 days a week. The public have to be able to access their services 5 days a week. I come from a constituency where most people work on production lines and in logistics. We need them to work 5 days a week. It's down to the employer to make that choice about how they want their people to work. It's not down to government to dictate.
Zoe?
Well, I think, first off, if you have a 4-day week in your business, it doesn't mean that the business will shut 1 day more a week. It means that people tend to be more flexible with their hours, and some people may take Mondays off, whereas other people take Fridays off. You know, that's a way you can do it to help improve capacity. I think all the metrics on the 4-day week trial showed that it massively increased people's health and well-being. It reduced burnout. I think of the 61 companies that participated in the nationwide trial, 56 continued with it. They found it really successful with their business model. It didn't affect their revenues. In fact, in some places it went up. And I think when we have an incredibly sick population, incredibly unhappy, depressed population who are dealing with all sorts of ailments, and we know that work, where it used to be something that made you healthier, in many industries now it does make you sicker, I think it's something we should be considering. And I think consider it with a raft of other things: better flexible working, enhanced remote working. When we also have a crisis in the caring industry, when we have parents who aren't able, you know, 2 parents who work, who aren't able to look after their kids and afford childcare, why not consider it? With modern technology, I think it's exactly the sort of conversation we should be having.
Jo?
Yeah, I'm glad we heard from the MP who's sort of bringing it. This is a reduction in hours. This is less work. This isn't just putting work into 4 days.
Compressed hours.
Well, I think he said 32-hour week, actually.
Well, yes, it's one of the things to consider, yes.
Yeah, so we have flexible working in this country, which I support, and there are opportunities for employees to work full-hour week in 4 days, which I support. But I think what this bill is trying to do is mandate 4-day working on reduced hours.
Well, Peter, perhaps you can clarify for us.
Look, I've said, and I repeat, This is an attempt to have a debate about moving to a 32-hour week.
Yeah.
I'm not going to tell. I'm not going to tell organisations, companies how they should do that. This is trying to initiate a workers' council to discuss and debate this across industry with trade union representatives, organisations. So that's the aim of this.
Yes,
this
but
bill.
Peter, to be clear, it is about fewer hours across the week for the same pay.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
So.
Yeah, and I'm very grateful to him for clarifying that. I don't support it, and I don't think the public do.
Right.
Well, the good news is this has actually been tried thereabouts in France. In about 2000, they mandated a 35-hour working week. It's actually a little more than the one that Mr. Dow is proposing, and it was essentially a disaster because what you saw was that overtime was not allowed in employment law, jobs were left unfinished, and people just walked away from their place of employment. And I think having flexible employment where you work and where you do that is a good thing, particularly in a sort of post-pandemic world where all of our things have changed. But I think making this strict thing would be a mad thing, and this employment rights bill that's going through by the government's own estimates is already costing businesses about £5 billion in the extra overheads. And last time that a 4-day working week was proposed, analysis would be that it would cost billions of pounds to the economy and lost productivity. And we already have dire productivity in this country. So it just feels as if that's the wrong place that we should be going.
Well, Peter, it would be a disaster, evidenced in France.
You know what? That's exactly the same argument that was used when we had minimum pay. It was going to crash the economy. It was exactly the same argument used when, in 1938, we introduced paid leave for workers. It was exactly the same argument when we introduced the Act in relating to equal pay for women. Every time there's a move in a progressive fashion to give people a better living, a better lifestyle, you get the same old hackneyed arguments about the economy will be affected by it, productivity will go down, etc., etc. And it doesn't prove to be the case. Go to those companies who've trialled this and are continuing to do it.
Which companies are
there
those?
are companies right across the spectrum. There's engineering, there's technology, the computer sciences, there are charities, there are local government. South Cambridgeshire trialled it in the middle of a trial of it now, and they found it much more productive. They've got less absenteeism, they've got better retention. So the evidence is there. Now, don't take my word for that. Go and look at the surveys, but also, more importantly, let's have the debate.
All right.
Let's not just brush it aside. And that's what I hope this Parliament, that's what I hope this bill will actually do.
I do. It's Seb.
What I would say is, like, this is putting a fixed cap on working hours. That is not the same as talking about, you know, things like minimum wage or changing equality law. They are very, very different things. And again, Mr. Dowd talks about examples where there have been various trials. Some have worked in some industries, some have not worked in other industries. The problem I have with this is mandating it across the whole economy because it simply will not work. You know, Joe mentioned public services being one example. If you did this in the NHS, for example, it's the exact opposite direction. We need more flexibility.
But in the NHS, where you also have, say, a very high proportion of female workers, you could argue that would get female workers back to the workplace because they would have more flexibility with their childcare responsibilities. So you had two parents on a 4-day week. One could take the Monday off, one could take the Friday off, and then that's less money spent on childcare.
But this isn't just flexible working. This is about fewer hours that you can do.
Not every,
but nurses working really hard in the NHS aren't going to want to work fewer hours and get paid less.
It's not like the economy shuts on a Friday. Companies can decide what days they allow people to work their 4-day weeks. It is a flexibility.
It means people just work less. They're going to want to be paid the same. They're not going to want to take a pay cut.
In a family environment, if you have two parents who have a 4-day week,
flexible working, which I support. I support flexible working, compressed working, different hours for employers to be flexible.
The one point about compressed working in terms of retention and recruitment, yes, for the same pay. If productivity were shown to have increased and improved in certain settings, would it be something you'd consider?
I think we're in a sort of place where we have to build back Britain, and it's about us all putting our shoulders to the winding wheel and get working. We cannot have that capacity if we're reducing our hours to 32 a week. It's just not possible. I don't think it will work. Most people, we have a tradition of working 5 days a week. We've introduced flexible working so people can work around that, whatever hours they're working. We enable people to work part-time for periods in their life when they want to. Yeah. And what the biggest issue is pay. Are you being paid well for the job? You know, I want to increase minimum wage every year so that people are valued for the work that they do.
Jo?
I think we're getting into sort of fantasy world here. It's assuming that people work in offices and they can just work a bit harder. You know, nurses, my sister's a nurse, work really hard in hospitals. If you just reduce the time they spend in hospitals but pay them the same, we'll need more nurses. You can't pretend they can work harder and achieve the same over a shorter period. They have to be in hospital caring for and supporting people.
Peter?
Well, look, evidence shows that you have better productivity, despite the fact that we have some of the longest working hours in Europe. We are 27% less productive than the Germans. So those arguments fall away. It isn't just about how many hours you work. It's actually about how productive those are. And can I also say this? As people are having to work longer in their lives to 67, 68, isn't it time to maybe rebalance that with a shorter working week? Because if people are going to be working 3, 4, 5 years longer,
right. Well,
why not rebalance it in that way?
Well, Peter, the MPs here don't seem to be convinced at the moment, but you've got that amendment. Let me ask you about another issue that we've already discussed on the programme, and that's the guidance that's being issued by the government to Home Office care workers, that people who arrive on small boats will not, in the main, be able to apply for citizenship. Is that the way to go to solve this crisis?
Well, I think some of the issues that are going to be raised in the border security bill and asylum bill as we go into committee stage will tease many of these issues out, and I look forward to the debate on this.
Yes, and what will you say?
Well, I'll see what the arguments are. I look forward to the debates as I always do in relation to bill committees.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter Dowd. Not keen, obviously, to say what he feels about that particular guidance. Let me just show you this in The Independent. First MP's U-turn on support for assisted dying bill after High Court judge safeguard removed. Seb, how many more do you think that... I know you can't say exactly how many more, but do you think it might lead to more MPs changing their mind? We discussed it at length yesterday after Kim Leadbeater said they're going to have a panel of people deciding rather than a High Court judge alone. Only 28 MPs are needed to change their minds.
I think that this thing has got into a real mess now, because when the bill passed its second reading in November, Kim Leadbeater said that the safeguards would not be weakened. This would be the strongest bill in the world on assisted dying, and that's already U-turned. And the reason for that maybe is a fair one, which is that it would stack up the judiciary. It would be so many cases, it would overburden our family courts that are already under pressure. But the fact is, it's still weakening the safeguards on this. And I think from the Lib Dems, I think you've seen 2 Reform MPs have already said they're going to change.
Lee Anderson and Rupert Lowe.
Exactly. But I think on the Conservative side as well, there are many who are looking at this and thinking this is not just right. And I personally feel that Kim Leadbeater should pull this bill, because trying to do one of the most complex and morally significant things that will be of this Parliament through a private member's bill is the wrong mechanism to do it. And if Keir Starmer, who said he's in favour of this, if he wants to do it, there should be a government bill to get full scrutiny and full involvement from the whole House, because trying to do this through a private member's bill is just simply not working. The way this has been done, I think, just highlights that the process is wrong, whether you're for or against it.
Should she pull the bill, Kim Leadbeater?
No. The right to abortion actually came through a private member's bill initially with David Steele's bill. So I think there is a history there. It is very much a moral issue. I voted in favour of the bill, and I actually believe this is a strengthening of the bill, because my concern, I did have concerns when I voted for it, and one of the concerns was how can a judge-led decision-making process actually get the right decision, because I thought there should be a proper hearing, and I didn't know how that was going to pan out. I was waiting to hear that come through the committee process. But also there's the issue of coercion. And are people taking that decision because they don't want to be a burden on their family, or are people pushing them towards making that decision? By having a psychiatrist and a social worker listening, and actually listening thoroughly to a case and feeding information and talking to the judge. And it will be the judge who takes the final decision, but it's a panel-led decision. So they're actually listening to each other, interviewing the person or the representative to ensure that this is the best.
But what's your reaction to two MPs, Reform MPs in this case, who have changed their minds? I mean, do you think it's going to lead to others?
Look, Reform flip-flop and everything. And so I'm not surprised that they're more after headlines than...
You did say it's a moral issue, though.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
it's not, there's also Lib Dem MPs who've said to be changed their minds. So I'm not sure it's how people morally feel about this. And
I feel that they should be listening to what Kim Leadbeater is saying. I strongly believe it strengthens the bill.
Jo, what's your reaction, first of all, to two MPs U-turning or changing their minds?
Yeah, so I found it really difficult. And I only made up my mind during the debate and voted against the bill, but genuinely open-minded to see what comes back. This puts me off changing my mind, so keeping me on the no side, because removing a judicial oversight, however the wording is presented, is clearly a weakening of safeguards. Whether you think that's an improvement for other reasons, maybe. I think weakening safeguards is going to be a problem for a number of MPs who voted yes and now may switch. And
Kim Leadbeater did say that having that safeguard of the High Court judge would make us the most robust in terms of dealing with an issue like assisted dying. What's your view?
She did, yes. I think I've gone back and forth a bit on this, as I suspect most of us have, and I think my understanding is the reason that they have replaced this High Court judge with a panel is exactly as you said, Jo, which is spotting coercion. They believe that psychiatrists and a counsellor would be better equipped,
and pressure on the judicial system
to spot coercion in these cases. But as you say, equally, there is a worry now that makes us less robust, that could mean that, there is an injustice that is passed. And even, in one of these cases...
It's time for PMQs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week we progressed our Borders Bill to deliver counter-terrorism-style powers to bring vile criminal smuggling gangs to justice. We also announced a further £350 million to get Britain building and deliver 1.5 million new homes our country desperately needs, including more affordable homes. We've slashed red tape that holds businesses and working people back, creating 10,000 more apprentices. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was proud to have played my part in helping draft what has now become the Employment Rights Bill. A new poll shows 3/4 of the British public back the stronger rights for workers in the bill, including better sick pay. Yet that lot over there, the Tories and Reform, disgracefully voted against it. In fact, the leader of the opposition doesn't even believe in maternity pay or the living wage. Mr. Speaker, our statutory sick pay is ranked one of the lowest in Europe. It needs to be brought in line with the living wage. So will the Prime Minister back my campaign to strengthen this bill further so sick pay is at the level that finally stops punishing workers for being sick?
Mr. Speaker, our plan for change delivers the biggest upgrade in workers' rights in a generation to our employment rights bill. Ending exploitative zero-hour contracts, ending the scandal of fire and rehire, extending statutory sick pay to 1.3 million employees. Of course, that's on top of the pay rise for 3 million of the lowest paid. I would have thought the Leader of the Opposition might actually sort of support day one protection employment rights, given where she's going, but she thinks maternity leave is excessive. Our plan is pro-worker and pro-growth.
Yeah. Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Beno.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government established the Ukraine Family Scheme, and in total, over 200,000 Ukrainians, mostly women, children and the elderly, have found sanctuary in the UK from Putin's war. However, a family of 6 from Gaza have applied to live in Britain using this scheme, and a judge has now ruled in their favour. This is not what the scheme was designed to do. This decision is completely wrong. It cannot be allowed to stand. Is the government planning to appeal on any points of law? And if so, which ones?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I do not agree with the decision. She's right. It's the wrong decision. She hasn't quite done her homework because the decision in question was taken under the last government. according to the legal framework from the last government. But, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. It should be Parliament that makes the rules on immigration. It should be the government that makes the policy. That is the principle, and the Home Secretary is already looking at the legal loophole which we need to close in this particular case.
Mr. Speaker, he did not answer the question. If he plans to appeal, then the appeal may be unsuccessful and the law will need to be changed. And if he does not appeal, the law definitely will need to be changed. He talks about a decision made under the last government. It was not made by the last government, it was made by the courts. The issue we are discussing today is about judicial decisions. We cannot be in a situation where we allow enormous numbers of people to exploit our laws in this way. There are millions of people all around the world in terrible situations. We cannot help them all, and we certainly cannot bring them all here. Will he commit to bringing forward that new legislation or amending his borders bill?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I've already said the Home Secretary has already got a team working on closing this loophole. We don't need to wait for that. We're getting on with that because we're taking control. They lost control of immigration. We had nearly 1 million people come into this country, had an open borders experiment. On a Monday of this week, they voted against increased powers to deal with those that are running the vile trade of people smuggling. Same old Tories, open borders, empty promises.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister was on top of his brief, perhaps he'd be able to answer some questions. Given this crazy decision and so many others, new legislation is needed to clarify the right to a family life in Article 8. I'm not talking about what he just said. I know Labour MPs don't understand much of what they're saying, but the Prime Minister literally wrote a book on the European Convention on Human Rights. This is a situation where we need to put our national interest before the ECHR. Does he agree that we should legislate even if lawyers warn that this might be incompatible with human rights law?
She complains about scripted answers and questions. Her script doesn't allow her to listen to the answer.
Prime Minister.
She asked me if we're going to change the law and close the loophole in question 1. I said yes. She asked me again in question 2, and I said yes. She asked me again in question 3. It's still yes.
Mr. Speaker, he didn't listen to question 1. I asked if he would appeal the decision. He did not answer that. He's not listening. He's too busy defending the international human rights law framework. Mr. Speaker, this case has arisen because a Palestinian came to the UK from Gaza in 2007. He is now a British citizen. This is precisely why we need to break the conveyor belt from arriving in the UK to acquiring indefinite leave to remain and then a British passport and now a right to bring 6 family members here as well. Just last week, the Prime Minister bizarrely claimed that a British passport was not a pull factor for those coming to the UK. Will he now support our plans to toughen the process on indefinite leave to remain and make getting a British passport a privilege, not a right?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, they presided over record high levels of immigration. It reached nearly 1 million. It was a one-nation experiment in open borders. And she was the cheerleader. She was the one campaigning for more people to come and thanking her own side when they supported her campaign. So before she lectures us, I think she needs to reflect on her own record and her own record here.
Mr. Speaker, he is the Prime Minister now. The people out there want to know what he is going to do about the situation. He needs to spend less time whining about the last government and do his job. I thought, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister and I both agreed that Israel had a right to defend herself. Yet the judge in this case noted that the family were facing a humanitarian crisis, and I quote, as a consequence of the Israeli government's indiscriminate attempts to eliminate Hamas, and government lawyers accepted this. Is the Prime Minister allowing lawyers to change the position on Israel? And was this because of advice from the Attorney General? And if not, why on earth did government lawyers accept the argument that Israeli actions were indiscriminate?
Prime Minister. They put the complete opposite argument. She talks about on top of her brief. She has no idea what she's talking about. I'll tell her again. We need to change the law. That's why the Home Secretary is already closing the gap. I know the script doesn't allow any adaptation, but this is getting tedious.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has not read the judgment. I suggest that he does. There are very serious questions now. There are very serious questions now being asked about the Attorney General, the Prime Minister's personal friend and donor. Even Labour ministers are concerned. One Labour peer, Lord Glassman, has called him the absolute archetype of an arrogant progressive fool. Yeah. If we are serious about protecting our borders, we need to make sure we appoint people who believe in our country and everything we stand for. It is not clear the Attorney General does. The government is now recruiting a new Chief Inspector of Borders who lives in Finland and wants to work from home. This is not serious. Why should the British public put up with this?
Prime Minister. The individual in question was appointed in 2019 by the last government to a senior position. He then worked for 5 years from Finland. We've changed that, and he's now going to be working from the United Kingdom full-time. Finland under them. And she talks about the Attorney General. She sat round the cabinet table with an attorney who was later sacked for breaching national security.
Charlotte Littles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Long-standing traders in the CPS Centre in Colchester were devastated to receive eviction notices, giving them just 28 days to vacate, entirely out of the blue and under spurious pretexts by the new owner, shell company Shivat Hananim Capital. So far, the owner and their legal representatives have failed to hear tenants' concerns and mine and to negotiate a way forward. So does the Prime Minister share my concerns at this situation, and will he set out our plans to protect independent businesses which are at the heart of our high street and communities?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Well, thank her for raising this, which is obviously of real concern to businesses in her constituency. We do, Mr. Speaker, expect landlords to meet their obligations to make buildings safe, and we support robust enforcement action from the regulators if they fail to do so. I will make sure that she gets a meeting with the Minister to discuss what steps can be taken in the particular case to support the businesses that her constituents rely on.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 80 years ago this week, the Allies began a pincer movement against German forces between the Ruhr and the Rhine. British and Canadian troops attacked from the north, Americans from the south. British, Canadian and American soldiers fighting shoulder to defeat fascists. 80 years on, President Trump seems to have forgotten all this. His tariffs against steel and aluminium will hit Canada the hardest and will also hit jobs and the cost of living in our country. So in reminding President Trump who America's true and long-standing friends and allies really are, will the Prime Minister also prepare a plan for tariffs in return, starting with tariffs on American electric cars?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he's right to reference our history in the 80-year anniversary. And of course, we were fighting alongside the Americans, and that is amongst the reasons we have a special relationship. British Steel is an essential part of our heartlands, and we will not abandon our skilled workforce. And it needs a level-headed assessment of the implications, which is what we're going through at the moment. But we will always put our national interest first and steelworkers first.
Yeah. Sir Ed Davey.
thank the Prime Minister for that reply, but it seems to me the way President Trump and his ally Musk are operating, they do need to hear strong measures and words from even their allies. And moving on to Ukraine, Mr. Speaker, if Ukraine is forced to surrender its own sovereign territory to Russia, it will be the greatest betrayal of a European ally since Poland in 1945. But President Trump says Ukraine may end up Russian, and he wants American money back. I think we all fear where this could end and the dangerous implications for our defence and our security. So can the Prime Minister reassure this House that he and other European leaders have given sufficient support to President Zelensky so that he can't be bullied by Trump and Putin into accepting a deal that will effectively hand victory to Russia?
Prime Minister.
As he knows, I met President Zelensky in Kyiv just a few weeks ago at my 8th meeting. The position since the outbreak of this conflict has been a united position across the House of supporting Ukraine, and I was able to reiterate my position, which is we must put Ukraine in the strongest possible position. That matters now just as much as it mattered at the beginning of this conflict, the strongest possible position, and I did discuss with him what more we can do, what more our allies can do to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position.
Kim Ledbeat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 years ago, from the benches opposite, I published my Healthy Britain report, recommending a cross-departmental approach to improving health and wellbeing. Now that we're in government, I'm delighted that ministers have hit the ground running, because running is obviously very healthy for you. So will the Prime Minister confirm that last week's announcement of an increase to the public health grants, which will help local services focus more on prevention and early intervention, is just the start of a long-term strategy that will make Britain healthier, happier and more productive, reduce pressure on the NHS and promote growth?
Well, I thank her for highlighting the important role that local communities play in supporting healthy lifestyles. I'm delighted, Mr. Speaker, we're providing almost £4 billion for the local health services that people rely on, and that's things like health visitors, stop smoking services and drug abuse treatments. I'll make sure that she meets the relevant minister to discuss.
Saoirse Eastwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, I get it. Nobody wants to get into a trade war. But, you know, unlike Peter Mandelson, sometimes you've got to stand up for what you believe in. My friends here in the DUP have learnt nothing from their mistake of backing Brexit and think that tariffs are a laughing matter. No. But would you agree with me that actually we need to stand up for ourselves, we need to back our workers, we need to back our businesses, not just in Lagan Valley, but indeed across the UK?
Yeah. Well, yes, of course. The US and the UK share a strong and balanced trading relationship. We invest hugely in each other's economies, and we will continue to work closely with President Trump to boost growth and to create jobs. And I reassure her we will always act in the best interests of businesses and working people across the whole of the United Kingdom, including, of course, Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was baffled on Monday that, given the chance to support legislation backed by the National Crime Agency to crack down on criminal smuggler gangs and secure our borders, the parties opposite, the Conservatives and Reform, linked arms in the voting lobby to vote against it. The Conservatives spent 3 years and £700 million on their ludicrous Rwanda scheme and saw 4 volunteers returned. Does the Prime Minister agree with me? There is only one party that is serious about repairing our broken immigration system.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and let me remind them what they voted against earlier this week in our Borders Bill. They voted against, that's Reform and the Tories, they voted against making it an offence to organise the buying, selling and transport of small boats, against making it an offence to endanger lives at sea, against and powers to arrest suspected people smugglers before the smuggling takes place. They voted against. They voted for open borders, both of them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Prime Minister gave yet another threadbare excuse for why he and his North London lawyer friends are giving away the Chagos Islands. Mr. Speaker, this is his decision, and he must own it. More importantly, he can't tell us, the British taxpayer, how much this is going to cost. Is it 9 billion? Is it 18 billion? Is it 52 billion? The Times have called this botched deal insane. Members of his own cabinet reportedly think it's impossible to understand. And one of his own MPs think it's the worst thing the Labour Party have ever done. So can the Prime Minister tell us which word he thinks best describes this deal?
Mr. Speaker, I set out the position in relation to Chagos Islands last week. I also offered the Leader of the Opposition a briefing on this, a high-level briefing. She still hasn't taken me up on that briefing. They're asking questions without wanting to know the facts. It's extraordinary. Mr. Speaker, someone who wants to be Prime Minister does not want to know the facts, even when she's offered a high-level briefing. He'd be better informed if she took me up on the offer of a briefing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will, I'm sure, want to congratulate Newcastle United on reaching the League Cup final after Arsenal's exit. But will he also, in what is National Apprentice Week, will he also congratulate the 600 apprentices learning trades from welding to quantity surveying as part of the Tyne Bridge restoration programme? And whilst I know he can't confirm bridging the funding gap left by the Tories, will he confirm that he is looking forward to seeing the Tyne Bridge restored in time for its 100th birthday in 2028?
Well, look, I'm going to struggle to sound delighted with the results of that particular football match, but look, it will be a special day for Newcastle fans. But the Tyne Bridge is an iconic North East landmark, and I congratulate the apprentices who are helping to restore this vital piece of infrastructure. As usual, the Tories made empty promises that they had no intention of keeping, including £2.9 billion worth of transport commitments that were never funded. We will look at the capital projects around the spending review and let her know as soon as we can.
Liz Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents, Peter and Maureen, have been married for 70 years. Peter is 93, and for the past few weeks, he has been stuck on a hospital ward, waiting to go home because a care package hasn't been arranged. Peter is missing home and missing Maureen. So will the Prime Minister reassure my constituents that the social care crisis will be tackled this year?
Well, can I thank her for raising this issue and the particular case of her constituents? And I also know this is deeply personal to her, and if I may, I extend my deepest sympathies to her and her family for their loss. We have taken immediate action on social care, already delivered £3.7 billion of additional investment, working on the first ever fair pay agreement for the sector and, of course, boosting the carers allowance. I invite her and everybody to work with the House on the longer-term reform that we need. Thank you.
Julie Mims.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. James Rennie is an outstanding specialist school in the heart of my Carlisle constituency. Having converted every spare corner into classrooms, exceeded its published admissions numbers, and already having 43 applications known for this September, it is literally bursting at the seams. It cannot expand any further, and what is clearly needed is a new specialist school for North Cumbria. What assurances can the Prime Minister give my constituents that his government will put children before ideology and allow local authorities to tackle the shortage in SEND provision?
Well, I thank you for raising this vital issue. It's not the first time it's come up. We are supporting mainstream schools to increase SEND expertise whilst also establishing dedicated SEN units. Because we need to make sure that special schools also can cater for those with the most complex needs. So we're working on this. It's come up time and again, but we are doing that vital initial steps.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dorothy House is an amazing hospice that supports terminally ill people in Frumeney, Somerset and their families, including my good friend Lisa. Next year, Dorothy House will be looking forward to celebrating 50 years of service, but they will also be facing an additional cost of £422,000 thanks to increases in employers' national insurance. Will the Prime Minister commit to meeting with me and representatives of the hospice sector to hear firsthand the impact of NICs and to work with them to find a solution?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, everyone deserves high quality and compassionate end-of-life care. The honourable member knows we inherited a £22 billion black hole in our public finances. That's why we took the difficult but right decisions to invest in our public services. I do recognise the pressure that hospices are facing, and that's why we invested £100 million into hospitals, with an additional £26 million to support children and young people's hospices. And I will make sure she gets a meeting with the relevant minister.
John Hodge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. A significant part of the dreadful legacy left by the previous Conservative government is a chronic underfunding of transport infrastructure, especially in the North East, as we've just heard from my honourable friend. So does the Prime Minister agree with me and the North East Mayor Kim McGuinness that redevelopment of the Leamside line, the disused Leamside line, that would reconnect Gateshead with Durham North, and increasing the capacity on the East Coast Main Line would bring the metro, help bring the metro to Washington in my constituency, and would bring much needed jobs, growth and opportunities to my region?
Well, I thank her, and both she and the North East Mayor are dedicated campaigners on this issue. The party opposite left us a host of unfunded promises, and public transport is in dire condition. Expanding the metro network has huge potential to drive growth and unlock new housing. I'm pleased that progress is being made on the business case.
Second Batty.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Earlier this week, we learned that the Prime Minister's close friend, the Attorney General, has in the past advised Caribbean nations on seeking trillions of pounds in reparations. He's been a key player in the surrender of the Chagos Islands and the related fiasco there, which will cost the taxpayers up to £18 billion, and has even advised Jerry Adams, who is standing in line to get compensation from the British government in Northern Ireland legacy payments, the quantum of which could cost up to £2.7 billion. Given the Attorney General's track record, does the Prime Minister have faith in his motives, and does he have confidence that his best friend represents good value for the British taxpayer?
Mr Speaker, we've long had the principle that everybody's entitled to legal representation in this country. That means that lawyers don't necessarily agree with their client. Now, the Conservative Party used to believe in that principle. If they now disagree with that principle, they should go and see the victims of very serious crime, including sexual crime, and tell them that under their provisions, the lawyer who disagreed with the perpetrator wouldn't be able to represent them, meaning that victims will be cross-examined by perpetrators because lawyers disagree with the perpetrator. That's never been the Conservative Party position. If it is now, they should say so.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Allergy School, launched just this week by the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation, is a free programme to support children with food allergies. Allergic disease is a growing issue in this country, with over 20 million people in the UK being affected. For this reason, it has never been more important for us to have a national allergy strategy and an allergy czar to drive and coordinate that action. Will the Prime Minister join me in welcoming this programme, and will he meet with me and the Foundation to talk about how we can work together to drive this issue forward?
Well, I thank her for raising this really important issue, because hospital admissions for allergies have risen sharply, particularly in the last 2 decades. I do welcome the work being carried out by the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation. We will respond to the recommendations of the National Allergy Strategy Group in due course, and I'll make sure she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss it.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My Oxfordshire constituency of Didcot and Wantage has seen a 35% population increase in the last 20 years. My constituents recognise the need for affordable housing, but the current planning system isn't delivering the GP surgeries, dentists and transport options that they need. Will the Prime Minister restore faith in the planning system and, as well as focusing on housing numbers, deliver the local targets for health services and wider infrastructure that growing communities need?
Well, thank you for his question. We are, of course, delivering the £1.5 million homes, but we're creating communities as well for the future. And so he's right that that must include good schools, GPs and reliable transport links. That's what makes a good community. And just today, Mr. Speaker, we announced an additional £350 million to deliver more affordable homes so more people can realise the dream of home ownership.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week is National Apprenticeship Week. As co-chair of the APPG for Apprenticeships, I can tell the Prime Minister that employers are very pleased to see the announcements this week that will make a real difference both in terms of the completion rate and the flexibility around apprenticeships. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that schools should be promoting apprenticeship alongside A-levels and other options? And can he tell us what more he's going to do to support more young people to get into an apprenticeship?
I'm very pleased that he's raised this issue and that we'll be able to give employers more flexibility over maths and English requirements. This is really important, Mr. Speaker. There are very many young people who didn't get the maths qualification they wanted at the time, but are very well suited for the future, want to play their part, and now they can get apprenticeships under the changes that we've made. And that's 10,000 extra apprenticeships. This is delivering for them, giving them a chance for the future to contributing, of course, to our economy.
Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Farming Minister told a conference of farmers that farming is not high in the pecking order for this government. Given the heartless family farm tax, is his minister correct? Yes or no?
Farming's top of the agenda as far as I'm concerned. That's why we put £5 billion to support farmers in the budget. They failed to spend £300 million on their watch on farming, and we set out our roadmap, which has been welcomed by the NFU, as she very well knows. It was described as long overdue. I wonder who didn't do it before.
Mr. Jewess, I'm sure you don't want to be leaving today. It's not the best day. Right. Natasha Irons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a graduate of the Croydon Youth Philharmonic Orchestra, the Prime Minister will know that youth services can broaden a young person's horizons beyond what they could ever imagine. But with national spending on youth services seeing a 73% decline since 2010, can the Prime Minister outline how this government will bring youth services back into our communities? Will he look at giving them the statutory protections they deserve? And will he visit Croydon East to see firsthand the vital role these services play in my constituency?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my days in the Croydon Youth Philharmonic Orchestra were a long time ago now. But we do fully recognise the importance of youth services to help young people save lives and live safe and healthy lives. We've been developing our plans for the new National Youth Strategy to bring power back to young people and help every young person realise their potential.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Every 22 minutes, a child in this country loses a parent or a loved one. That's 40,000 children every year facing a trauma which many of us here know can last a lifetime. Charities such as Winston's Wish do a fantastic job of providing support for young people, particularly when schools are closed or there's no one else to turn to. But at the moment, there's no simple way of the children knowing where the charities are or the charities being able to contact the children. So will the government back my private member's bill this summer to do just that? And would the Prime Minister meet me to discuss how we make sure that another generation of children does not have to face this trauma?
Well, can I thank her for her ongoing work and campaign on this important issue. The Cross-Government Bereavement Group continues to look at how we can improve access to the support that children and young people need at these difficult times. And of course, I'll make sure that she gets the meeting that she wants with the Minister to discuss this further.
David Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday marks the 20th anniversary of the launch of the Make Poverty History campaign, and a fantastic speech for all of us that were there, delivered by the late, great Mandiba. That campaign inspired a generation of campaigners and a great Labour government to deliver unprecedented action to tackle global poverty, lifting millions out of poverty. Will the Prime Minister join me in paying tribute to some of those campaigners and commit to doing all he can to ensure that Britain is playing its full part in helping eradicate global poverty today?
It's a really important issue. We do pay tribute, and of course we continue to play our full part.
Alex Bloor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Basingstoke Hospital, used by half of my constituency of North East Hampshire, has had its rebuild delayed by 15 years, despite no ministerial visit to see the worsening conditions there. The cost of maintaining the hospital for those 15 years is estimated to be almost as much as the rebuild itself. So can the Prime Minister explain the logic of making taxpayers pay twice?
Mr. Speaker, her constituents are right to be frustrated about the empty, unfunded promises that were left behind by the Conservatives, a point made by her and, of course, by the Labour MP for Basingstoke. Under the previous government's plan, a new hospital in Basingstoke would simply not have been delivered because it was unfunded. It was a promise without anything behind it. We've put in place a funded deliverable plan which will see the hospital built, and we'll work closely with the Trust to ensure that it is.
Dr Becky Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's devolution plans are a welcome progressive development to shift power and resources from Whitehall to our communities. But there are, of course, discussions now around the process and realisation of benefits for our communities. So can the Prime Minister assure my residents in Worthing West, and indeed all constituencies starting priority devolution programmes, that Sussex devolution will give us meaningful control over our local priorities, including housing, transport and social care?
Minister. Well, I thank her for raising devolution, which will see her constituents in Sussex get meaningful control over local priorities. The devolution priority programme, Mr. Speaker, will see a wave of mayors elected next year, including in Sussex, and I believe that those with skin in the game make the best decisions about their communities.
Final question, Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will be well aware of the Global Vaccination Fund, Gavi, one of the United Kingdom's great success stories. It's vaccinated from deadly diseases over 1 billion children under 5. It presents real value for money to British taxpayers, and over 80% of our constituents support it. Will you give the House today an undertaking that Britain will continue this leadership and make a decisive pledge at next month's replenishment conference?
Well, I'm grateful that this is a really important issue. As he rightly points out, I've long supported it and will continue to support and share details with him just as soon as I can. But it is important, have supported it, will continue to do so. Thank you.
Right, that completes Prime Minister's questions.
That brings us to the end of this week's session of Prime Minister's Questions. Let me introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live. For the BBC, Henry Zeffman, our Chief Political Correspondent, Chris Bryant for the Government, a Culture Minister, and we're hoping soon to be joined by Mims Davis, the Shadow Wales Secretary. So Kemi Badenoch focused her questions on a particular case in terms of immigration. If I just show everyone this headline in the Daily Telegraph, court gives Gazans, 6 Gazans in this case, right to settle in the UK. Refugees' successful use of Ukraine settlement scheme will open floodgates, the Home Office warns. Henry, just explain a little bit more about why this case was so important to Kemi Badenoch.
Well, this is a case that was decided by the Upper Immigration Tribunal a couple of weeks ago, but uncovered and put on the front page of the Daily Telegraph today, which is why Westminster knows about it now. It's a family of 6 seeking to flee Gaza. They made their application to seek asylum in the UK through the Ukraine family scheme, which was launched after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And they want to join the brother of the father, who has been in the UK since 2007. Now, initially, their application was denied, essentially on the basis that they applied for a Ukraine scheme and they're not Ukrainian. But that was appealed, and the upper tribunal judge has decided that though clearly they are not Ukrainian, their situation is pressing enough that he ruled that they should be able to come to the UK.
Right, the controversy, it seems, from Kemi Badenoch's perspective, is that this was allowed to happen and that it is something that should be stopped in any future cases. Perhaps potentially the issue was that Keir Starmer seemed to agree with her on some of the substance of her questions. He said he didn't agree with the initial decision to grant this family access through the Ukrainian scheme, and that they were looking at loopholes, and the Home Secretary was going to consider this further. Where did that leave Kemi Badenoch?
Well, it wasn't clear that she had a contingency plan in place nice if the Prime Minister said, as he did in response to her first question, that he agreed with her. Although I do think there is still more disagreement there than was perhaps completely obvious. So Keir Starmer said, I do not agree with this decision. It was the wrong decision, which would imply he thinks, as an eminent lawyer himself, that the judge made the incorrect decision on the law. But then he later said there's a legal loophole that the government is going to look at closing, which would imply that he thinks there's a problem with the statute and that the judge made a reasonable decision on that basis. So I'm a bit unsure there. I think the onus will be on the government fairly fast to give us a flavour of what law they think has a loophole in it and how quickly they're going to change it, because otherwise, I guess Conservatives would argue, you could well end up with many more people exploiting that loophole.
And using the Ukraine scheme. Let me welcome Mims Davies. Thank you so much for coming over from the House. I'll leave you just for a moment to catch your breath. Yeah, do breathe. Not too quietly. But Chris, first of all, what do you think about the decision in the first place? Should the court have given any access to this family of Gazans' right to settle in the UK in the first place?
Well, I don't know the ins and outs of the law itself. As you know, I've only just been dragged over from Parliament as well.
Not dragged, I hope.
Well, anyway, I was sitting in the chamber and told,
Yes.
could you come over now? But I think the point that Henry makes is a valid one. Is it a question of the law or is it a question of the decision? Now, I don't care, because in the end it's the outcome that is the wrong outcome. It just doesn't stand to any kind of reason that somebody coming from Gaza, whatever one may think about the situation in Gaza, and obviously everybody's hearts goes out to people who had a version of hell for the last 18 months. But nonetheless, it's difficult to see how a Gazan can come in under a Ukrainian design scheme. Now, the scheme was designed previously. I think Kemi Badenoch was part of the government that designed it. So the question is now for us, is it that the judge has made the wrong decision in law, or is it that there are loopholes in the law that need to be clarified? Because, precisely as you just said, the danger is that many more people could use precisely the same loophole. Right. Now, the Home Secretary's already on the case. We're already going through the legal situation. We've got more legislation coming up soon. If we need to amend the law, we'll amend the law.
Right, so presumably you're in agreement with all of that, Mims Davies. I mean, judges, courts, immigration tribunals implement government policy and, yes, to some extent interpret it. What is the problem you're trying to fix here?
So let me break this down. And when I was at DWP, I saw exactly this type of legislation and looked at it.
Brought in by Conservative government.
Looked at it very squarely because it would open the door for benefits and housing, etc. So these schemes were meant to be, whether it's for Yemenis or Syrians or indeed Ukrainians, to be exactly fitted for that particular reason.
So you don't agree with the decision?
You don't agree by judges when Parliament has been sovereign and clear about who that is for. And that was the point that, like Chris, I've just rushed over from Parliament, that Kemi was making. She also called the Prime Minister to look at the judgment. There was also some points in there that really need looking at. And Chris knows this. There's a bill on the table right now that the government can act on.
You voted against.
You
voted against on Monday. You're not going to claim our bill.
Legislation
no, but hang on. You're now going to...
Don't talk over each other. Let her finish and then let Chris...
Come on, Chris. You walked through that lobby 140 times and thereabouts.
Mims, you're just saying that you want to amend a bill that you voted against, even going into committee. It just doesn't stand to any kind of logic.
It isn't good enough.
Right.
Let me know it's not good enough, which is the reality of what we do in opposition. If we don't like it, we can say we don't like it.
Well, can I ask what you do want?
It works, Chris.
Right,
you
but
know that.
You wrote this law. The law that is being implemented by the courts, you wrote it, and you've just said yourself that when you were
in a way that's completely beyond its scope.
So what do you want to happen to judges then, or immigration What do you want to happen then to judges and immigration tribunals? Are you saying they're making the wrong decision, should be stopped?
So and Kemi pointed out of the box just now that actually even the stance that Israel protecting themselves had been interpreted in this judgment as well. It is really worth, and we're on TV right now after a strong exchange in the Commons, for people to fully go through that whole judgment and rightfully, as I think the Prime Minister was trying to say, the government to properly respond to it.
But I think the government...
Mims, it was not a strong exchange. It was just about the worst exchange from Kemi Badenoch. I'm old enough to remember, I don't think you were in the House, when Ian Duncan Smith was leader of the Conservative Party in opposition. He was better at it than she is.
Right, but in terms of what the government... Hang on, but in terms...
way that people are talking about Kemi, when she is standing up at the box, I see it consistently
She
from the
didn't
Prime
listen to
Minister.
the answers.
You don't know your homework, dear. You haven't done enough. And frankly,
He's
it
never said
sucks.
the word dear.
It's
That's
not
a lie
far
from
off.
you. That's a
It's not
straightforward
far off.
lie from you.
It's the pat on the head.
It's not.
You know, you
But
don't
if she,
know the
if she,
details.
no. So, for instance, on Chagos, she's been offered a security briefing repeatedly by the Prime Minister. She decides to hold forth on the subject without ever taking up the security briefing. That's her entitlement as leader of the opposition.
Is the Prime Minister
if she doesn't do her homework, she's not going to get a very good reception.
Is he being patronising, Chris?
No, it's not patronising.
He's
pointing out.
Of it by the looks at where I'm sat, and I was sat there 20 minutes ago.
He answered the question directly. He said, yes, it's the wrong decision.
And we asked,
she asked
will
the
you
next
appeal
question.
it? Will
She
you
said,
appeal it?
he
And
said
he
yes.
didn't answer that one.
Repeal? How does
Appeal,
Parliament...
Appeal, I said.
Will the government that's a matter for legal...
That is a different thing.
Let me come back, though, because that is quite a strong sort of claim that you're making, that the Prime Minister is treating the leader of the opposition in a way that is patronising by saying that she's not done her homework. But has she done her homework on this?
Anybody over the last few weeks will see that's very much an approach.
Really? What other example?
There's plenty of pointing of, oh, you haven't taken the briefings or whatever. You know,
Why hasn't she taken the briefing?
To Pretty, she knows what she's talking about. She feels very often that the approach at the box is not right. I think it should be more respectful. Look, it's up to him to decide how he behaves.
Hang on.
We're not in there for an easy ride.
Right.
Hang on. Priti Patel, who was found to have bullied staff in her department by the independent advisor on ministerial advice, is complaining about attitudes at the dispatch box. The person was found guilty
you're on
of bullying.
Some shaky ground about the way people talk about others, etc. when it comes to WhatsApp. Look, let's do the substance of today.
Right, I will
Let's do that. It's
we will.
Really important.
I'm going to come.
Minister for 5 years at DWP.
But if you don't mind me saying, you guys have slightly moved off the actual substance. Before we come back to it,
well, don't
Henry,
say you weren't enjoying it, Jane.
well, don't assume what I enjoy and don't enjoy. But listen, on the basis of last week's exchanges between Government Minister and Shadow, and today, now Mim's saying that they're unhappy with the way the Prime Minister is talking to or treating. You're all right. Well, treating Kemi Badenoch. Do you think that's fair? Kemi Badenoch is quite combative too, and these exchanges are usually quite robust. But what do you make of that in terms of how politicians are treating each other at the dispatch box?
I think it's certainly true that it's not the warmest double act I've ever seen in my years watching PMQs. And you do sometimes have that, by the way. You know, actually, I think Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, it was more kind of... some people would say boring, some people would say grown up, but whatever it was, I think they basically respected each other as people in a way that Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson did not. They loathed
And David Cameron and Jeremy Corbyn was an interesting combination.
I mean, I think actually David Cameron and Jeremy Corbyn, it was sort of Cameron thought it was so bizarre that they didn't even engage on quite the level that
well, Blair and
usually
Hay
do.
Also, I think there was a degree of respect from either side.
All right, let's get back to the substance very briefly, because we have to talk about housing in just a moment. The substance of this issue, are you satisfied, Mims Davies, that the Prime Minister has said, I didn't agree and don't agree with that decision in the first place, and that the Home Secretary is looking at any loopholes that might have led to this particular family of Gazans being able to use the Ukraine settlement scheme to have and come here and with a right to settle?
I think Kemi pointed out of the box, looking at the full judgment and the interpretation, I think the question was, are you going to appeal it? That is different to saying the Home Secretary's looking at it.
Right.
And as Chris said, there is a bill coming up where, if any clarification is needed. But as I say, I looked at many of these schemes at DWP in conjunction with the Home Office to make sure, and you could look at a wraparound opportunity to cover every need, and it was decided that we should make sure that there's a specific scheme for any specific need.
All right.
Which is why there was one on Yemeni, why there would be one, of course, on Ukraine.
All right, well, look...
And this one has been interpreted for people applying from Gaza, somebody from 2007, thereabouts, who's then asked for their family to be reunited.
All right, well,
That's how it's been interpreted.
Well, we'll watch it,
questions
right?
of the government to have a look at that and find a route to make it go back to what it was intended for, protecting Ukrainians.
We'll watch it carefully. Just one final thing. This headline in The Guardian, Labour peer calls for arrogant Attorney-General to be sacked. The Attorney-General is Richard Hermer. Kemi Badenoch mentioned him as well. The Blue Labour founder, to the right of the Labour Party, Maurice Glassman, also calls for Richard Herman, a progressive fool. He said, actually, he should go. Do you agree?
No, I don't. I think, and my personal experience as a minister is that the advice that we're getting into the departments from the Attorney General is really, really helpful. Can I just make one point going back to on the subject, which is just that I think the one thing I've learned from all of this is that when you're writing legislation around immigration, you have to make it watertight so that judges have less wriggle room and that the will of Parliament is more clearly followed through. I think the problem with this is that the legislation wasn't very well written, and we need to make sure that legislation is well written in the future.
Let's talk
about. That's why we're voting against your rubbish bill.
All right. Well, on that collaborative note, let's talk about social housing. What is the government announcing, Henry?
Well, this is a relatively modest part of the government's broader housing ambitions, and their housing plans really are at the centre of their plans for economic growth. You know, whether they work or not really will be one of the big questions of the next few years. What's being announced today is £350 million of existing money. It's not newly committed money. £300 million of it, Angela Rayner says, will deliver 2,800 affordable homes, though only about half of those will be for social rent. And then a separate £50 million could be used for 250 more council homes. I mean, I think housing campaigners, housing charities, organisations like Shelter are saying, fine, but quite small when you look at the scale of the challenge. And remember, the broader target that the government has on housing, 1.5 million more homes over the course of this Parliament, so probably by 2029. That is a very tall order, even by the government's own admission.
Well, we can speak to Jason Piggott. Hello to you, Jason, who is a bus driver, lives in Portsmouth, and alongside his partner Sam and their 5 children, you were evicted from the house you were renting a year ago and have had to move into temporary accommodation because you were priced out of the local renting market. Tell us a little bit more about your personal experience.
Good afternoon. Yeah, it was going back in, it all started in about July, in 2023. So we started getting the eviction notice. We've gone to our local council, not getting too much involved, but the way the local council tell you to do things, in my opinion, is wrong. So they housed us in a hotel for 6 weeks, which was classed as emergency accommodation. And then after those 6 weeks, they've put us into a temporary accommodation, which is a 3-bedroom house for 5 children and 2 adults.
How has all this sort of uncertainty and upheaval impacted you and your family?
So I've got a child who's got ADHD and autism, and trying to explain things to him on a daily basis on what's happening and where we stand, it's quite difficult. We've had no communication from the council. I've had 2 housing officers in that time. My housing officer has emailed me to introduce herself, not a face-to-face meeting. I don't know what she looks like. I don't know who she is. There's the communication from, as I say, Portsmouth City Council is appalling.
Okay.
But on a day-to-day basis, because of where we are, we were told not to move the children's school, to try and keep them in the school that they are. And they have to walk in total 2.4 miles a day.
No, I mean, we can hear and see the difficulties that you're facing. In terms of the announcement today from Angela Rayner and from the government, 1,400 extra homes for social rent. What's your response?
Well, good luck, because I don't think you're going to be able to do it. It's a tall order, in my opinion, because it's OK giving the council that sort of money to build the houses, but isn't it having the land as well to try and build those houses? All
right, well, let's get some reaction. We have a government minister here and also a member of the opposition. Chris, first of all, your reaction to what you've heard from Jason. You may have heard similar stories, but it is extremely difficult, isn't it, for families in that situation?
Yes, I mean, I have dozens of cases in my own constituency. The pattern of social housing in the South Wales valleys is slightly different from somewhere like Portsmouth, where Jason is. Look, I mean, I noted Jason said good luck.
Yeah.
And I hope he means that good luck. I hope you get there.
Or good luck, he doesn't think you're going to make it.
Well, so we have to, is the point. We just have to, because there's a whole generation of families that are really, really struggling to be able to find. Some of them in the private rented sector, some of them, just trying to get on the housing ladder or thinking that it's completely impossible for them to get on the housing ladder. And in the end, a lot of that is about supply. There's enormous demand and there simply isn't enough supply. So we've got to build more houses and it's got to be a mixed economy. As I say, you've got to have a private rented sector. You've got to have which has got to be well regulated so that people aren't being ripped off and the taxpayer isn't being ripped off. You've got to make sure that you've got to have good social housing that is run by housing associations or local authorities. And you've got to have the right mix of houses.
All right, well, let me get Jason to respond to what he's heard.
I know I've found out that Portsmouth City Council were given 5.3 million by the government to build social housing or to build houses within like the Portsmouth area. As you walk around Portsmouth or you drive around Portsmouth, there are no signs up to say that Portsmouth City Council are building these houses. It's housing association. So my question is, you're saying that it has to be done. How are you going to achieve it?
So first of all, we've got to put the money aside. Secondly, we've got to make sure that we've got the people who have got the skills to build places. Thirdly, you're absolutely right about the land. We need to have enough land around the country to be able to... And in some cases, we're going to be creating new towns deliberately. We need to make sure that those have got all the facilities that they need, like GPs and schools and I would argue probably a data centre and good mobile connectivity and all the rest of it. But you're right, it's got to be... We've got to throw everything at this. Because otherwise, I mean, kids will be growing up in accommodation which isn't suitable for them, impossible for them to do their homework properly, and that creates a whole series of another generation of problems. So, honestly, we're desperate to do everything we possibly can. So, but there's one other thing we're going to have to change. We're going to have to change some of the planning laws so that people are going to have things built. Sorry, Jason?
Sorry to interrupt you, Chris. I think what you also need to do is change the amount of money that private landlords actually charge tenants for a house, because sometimes it's out of their budget, which is why they're going to the council for help.
Oh,
yeah. It's out of anybody's budget.
Not,
all right.
Yeah, and it's not right.
Yeah. Well, Jason, let me bring in Mims Davis, because the Conservatives were in power for 14 years until July last year. You heard that Jason's problems started in 2023. Not enough home.
We're with the Lib Dems. People always forget that. Look, Jason, this is tough. You are living in a city which is incredibly densely populated. There isn't masses of land there, and anything that is able to be developed needs to come forward for you and your families. When I was at DWP, we raised up the local housing allowance to try to help people meet their housing needs.
But just before you say what you did do you want to admit that you didn't do enough? You let people down. You let people like Jason down. Families like his are in this situation because you didn't grapple this issue of building homes.
On average, about 31 billion quid a year helping people with their rent and their responsibilities. And if they don't get out of needing rent or mortgages paid into their retirement, they need help as well. And it is projected with demographics to go up to around 40 billion a year. This matters. So being able to help people meet their rent is really important. But getting on the housing ladder.
It's about the supply. It's about the supply of homes. There aren't enough of them. There aren't enough of them affordable, less affordable,
and I was with the Community Land Trust just this week in my constituency, who's trying to get access to cash to build one-bed starter homes. So I'd love Angela Rayner to come down and look at some of these schemes that some of our local villages are bringing forward, because these all make a difference. I agree with Chris. To make this change for families like Jason...
Yes, because you failed to do so. I mean, you could apologise to families like Jason's.
I'm sorry to see Jason's situation, and what he needs is answers. And the reality is we've all got to use every sinew to make an answer. But also you've got a lot of people who feel very under threat about the green spaces. My constituency's been split in half because we've built so many houses.
All right, well, Jason, let me get Jason to...
Houses are taking them away from cities.
Do you accept that?
Putting them into rural areas where there's
let Jason respond.
Buses that Jason drives.
I'm sorry, but isn't this the Conservatives' fault in the first place? Because wasn't it Lady Maggie Thatcher that decided that people can buy their council houses. And because people decided that they were going to buy their council houses, the council didn't have a backup plan to try and build more houses. So, sorry, Conservatives are to blame for this. Labour, I don't think they're going to be able to fix the problem, and it's going to be an ongoing problem until land's found, like Chris
But
said.
you're not scrapping the policy, are you, for people to be able to buy their council homes? You put your thumb up and... No, not you, Jason. This is Chris. Sorry.
No, so I've...
That rent needs to be paid forevermore.
Well, let Chris respond.
So one of the things I've always argued is it's fine to allow people to buy their council house. That's been a great thing for many, many families up and down the land. But the money that was raised by selling those should have been spent on building more council houses. That should have been the policy from the beginning of time, and it wasn't. And that's one of the reasons that we've had, for decades now, far too few social housing. There's one other thing that I found in the last couple of years of the Tory government was that because they were so slow in increasing the amount of money that there was in support, it meant more people were simply closing down their private rent.
All right, Jason, thank you very much for joining us. We haven't got very long left before we have to say goodbye. Henry, tomorrow, will we hear any more about this housing announcement?
Yes, I think we will. I think the government's very eager to talk about housing all the time because, as well as being key to many people's personal circumstances, it's key to their economic policy.
That's all we have time for. Bye-bye.